Welcome to Higher Edification, a podcast featuring college presidents and other higher education leaders talking about the state of higher education, as well as the challenges and opportunities we face. Higher Edification is a production of AICUP, the Association of Independent Colleges and Universities of Pennsylvania, and Misericordia University. I'm one of your hosts, President Dan Myers of Misericordia University, also known as President Dan on TikTok. My co-host is Tom Foley, the president of AICUP, and we are delighted to welcome our guest, Tom Flynn, who is the president emeritus of Alvernia University, here on the podcast today.
Well, good day, Thomas. It's great to have you with us. You are a dear friend of both of your hosts here today, and it's a real treat that we get to spend this bit of time with you. Don't know if we'll get through all of this, Tom, but we thought we'd try to talk to you about three areas where you have tremendous experience and expertise. One, talk a little bit about your time at Alvernia, and I have a couple of specific things that I hope you'll talk to. Secondly, about your time now helping other presidents, recovering presidents like myself, and what you have seen and what you have learned there. And then lastly, just to have a bit of a chat about the current state of affairs in culture war America for higher ed. So let's go to that first topic, Tom. I am, of course, having served at the same time as you, very familiar with fabulous work that you did. And could we start by you telling us a little bit, one of the areas in which you're a model, Tom, was the town-gown relationships and what you built there in a variety of ways, economic, but also cultural and social. Anyway, your thoughts on that topic?
Well, it's interesting. The only time in my career where I interviewed for a presidency, and when I asked them what were the two or at most three things they were most looking for in the president, only one time did the trustees on the search committee say community leadership. And that quickened my interest in Alvernia. I did not know much about Alvernia before I was recruited to go there. My predecessor had been highly visible, serving on boards, being a presence in the community, but we weren't seen as a community leader. I was fortunate that I became president right around the time that the whole anchor institution movement was really taking off. And Tom, you and I had some contact with that. There was a conference in Belfast I went to that was on that. And I very much saw Alvernia as a place that needed to be an anchor institution. Would I have felt the same way if we were in a big middle class, prosperous community? Probably less so. But certainly for Reading, it was a very important part of what we needed to do. Our strategic plan, which is now back 15, 16 years ago, one of the four major priorities was community engagement. And this was a time in which you wouldn't have a strategic plan that might not have a goal on it, but we put that right at the center of it. And at my inauguration, I announced two centers of excellence, neither of which were named at that point, but they ultimately became the Holleran Center for Community and Global Engagement and the Opake Institute for Ethics, Leadership, and Public Service, named after Mike Opake. And those really catalyzed Alvernia's work. And, over the next 10 years, last night we had the 10th anniversary of the Reading Collegiate Scholars, and the two people who led those institutes under me for most of my time there were both there. I got a chance to pay tribute to them publicly. And we became nationally known for community engagement, always in the highest ranked category. We did do some economic development work, but the centerpiece for us was education of students in the inner city. And we now have over 40 students who have graduated from the Reading Collegiate Scholars Program with an average GPA of 3.5, and every single one of them has a high-paying job living in Berks County and Reading. So that whole business of expanding access, I'm old enough to remember the big expanding access move in the late 80s and 90s, but we expanded access, but we didn't expand success. And the thing that's very important is that we give students the cultural support they need. Our students, we discovered, didn't need academic support. I mean, they were bright. What they needed was cultural support and encouragement. As I said last night, two women who I remember vividly, one was the only one in her three-generation family that had a driver's license, and the other one was the only one who spoke English. So the Reading Collegiate Scholars Program was central to that. And then the interfaith work. And the interfaith work, to be very candid, came out of my background. I grew up on a street that was completely Caucasian, but it was 1/3 Catholic, 1/3 Protestant, 1/3 Jew. Right on the edge of the city of Boston, kind of an unusual neighborhood in that sense, sort of lower middle class. So two of my playmates were Jews. When Helen and I got married, Larry and Linda stood beside us as witnesses. We stood under the chuppah when they got married. And so interfaith life was very much a part of who I was as an individual. And when I got to Alvernia, we did some good work on the campus. Ibu Patel was certainly a good influence on us. But I think we were different from most other CIC private schools in that our interfaith leadership was in the community. And we became really the leader of interfaith work, working with the Jewish Federation, working with the Muslim community in particular. And both the Reading Collegiate Scholars Program and the interfaith work are the two things I look back on my 40-year career and feel the best about.
Tom, we need to point out you were ahead of the curve by a lot, I think, in a lot of things in your life, but certainly on that, Tom. I remember the very moving part of the event when you were retiring, where
Yes.
that community, all of those communities came together.
Yes.
Very, very, the only thing I can compare that to, Tom, I went to the retirement of a colleague in Canada who had paid special interest to First Nations people, and the same, just very moving. It was the introduction to your whole ceremony, having engaged these communities long before most institutions were doing that. And you will be long remembered for it, Tom, as you were that day.
Well, a seed for this that had nothing to do with my personal life was that in the late 1980s, Carol Schneider, I was one of Carol Schneider's young pups that was going across the country and talking about general education and revising core curriculum and cultural legacies. And there was a lot of talk about diversity. Of course, since it's America, there's no social or economic class. So class wasn't talked about, but race was talked about, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation. I couldn't get anyone to talk about religious diversity because, of course, the academy is sort of aggressively secular and aggressively, if you will, sort of hostile to religion. And of course, today, religious diversity is arguably the biggest challenge that we face. So I think interfaith work is absolutely something where, as a Catholic university, I think interfaith work needs to be central for Catholic universities, but I think it's also very important for institutions that don't have necessarily a strong religious tradition. My Bernardine Franciscan sisters, when it was time for my inauguration, I asked them that on the morning of the inauguration, instead of having a mass, could we have an interfaith service? And we had, this is back in 2006, the largest interfaith service in Reading history. And that sort of set the tone. And you're nice to remind us, the bookend was when I left office, we had another one of those.
I'm sorry, Dan, you go ahead.
That's all right. I was just wondering, you mentioned coming from a Catholic tradition there. I just wondered if you feel like it's tougher or easier to do it when you have an established religious identity for your institution, or if you were secular and not, and trying to do interreligious stuff. I mean, do people approach you in the same way if you're a Catholic institution and you're a Catholic person as well? How does that work out? I mean, is it easier or tougher? Is there different bridges to jump there? What happens?
I think it depends. I think it depends completely on the culture of the particular school, and particularly the faculty culture. I mean, my previous institution, when we had a philosopher do a homily at a service, and we had 7 or 8 different faiths represented. And the comment in the faculty lounge on Monday morning was I was trying to turn it into a Catholic institution, even though most of the people that had spoken weren't Catholic. So I think there's so much resistance to religious belief in the academy that I think it depends on the institution. I think there is an advantage in some ways for the institution to have some kind of religious tradition because it gives you a place to stand, and it allows you to sort of enter into the experience of the other. But I don't think that there's any one size fits all in that regard. And frankly, there are many Catholic schools that would have no interest in interfaith work, and others who would put it, at the center. So I think it's very much institution specific. And for Catholic institutions, a lot depends on the sponsoring religious order. I mean, my sisters, I didn't know this when I went there, but my sisters happen to be very, very assertive around meeting the other and serving the underserved and working with people different from them. So for them, it was a very good fit.
Mhm.
Tom, I think in some ways that work that you began a long time ago is seminal, especially as Dan and I look at the landscape today. Because part of what you were doing, even beyond the interreligious aspect of it, is you were building machinery.
Right.
You were building dialogue machinery. And
Right.
you and I, Tom, have talked about my work during the Troubles in Belfast. And
Right.
that was exactly the issue there. There was no machinery between the two
Right.
communities. There was nothing institutional. And that's a lot of what I was doing, was finding those devices. And you did that. And as I said, and we'll close this part maybe with this comment, that was so moving, Tom, because you could see, it was almost palpable, how much people had benefited from experiencing the other in the many formats and programs that you provided, but not just for Alvernia, for your whole community.
No.
And Dan and I find now we have colleagues who are struggling, especially in the most recent context of Gaza and the Middle East. And the biggest reason they're struggling is just that they didn't have the machinery in place,
That's right.
so that you can immediately begin a dialogue that is open, that is inclusive. And maybe that gets us there. And I think that's the only reason we're seeing, one congressional investigation after another, kind of picking on certain institutions that in the end, I think will abide themselves well because they do have machinery. But anyway, that was a real example, Tom, and we thank you for that. Maybe last question in this part about your Alvernia experience, Tom. Anything, and we are going to ask this of every president who's in your position, anything that you would change in the way that you approached your presidency now that you're a few years removed?
I should have been thinking about that question, but I know the answer to this because I've thought about it a lot. I wouldn't change it, but I think it was a weakness of mine. And Foley, as you know, at our age, one of the reasons we don't change certain things is that we're happy the way we are. I wish that I had put more emphasis on leadership development, both for my team and mid-management. We outsourced HR and we got very good service, but we didn't get the kind of leadership you get when you have HR as part of the senior team. I've come to believe that the senior HR person needs to be at least on extended cabinet. I wish that I had put more emphasis on team building and leadership development. I did it more by instinct, so there was some good stuff done, but it wasn't something that I had a lot of interest in. It was, I just sort of thought, you just have to be a good person and work with people. And I didn't have a particularly sophisticated approach to it. And I'm not sure I would do it differently because it takes a lot of time to do it well. But I think that was one of the weaknesses that I wish in retrospect I had done better with.
That is so thoughtful and thought-provoking, Tom. Dan, what do you, that comment, any reflections in your experience?
Yeah, well, I've been a president and served on cabinets for quite a while now. And I do think those experiences are very valuable, even in the most dysfunctional organization I was in. When we were able to do that, it improved the situation without question. And it allowed people to work together better. And sometimes when we started doing them, everybody was rolling their eyes and this is so hokey and blah, fuzzy, touchy feely stuff. They didn't want to do it. But at the end of the day, the organization did actually function better for having done those things, even if they seem a little bit goofy and like you're at summer camp or something, and there's that kind of stuff. And then there's very sophisticated kinds of guidance you can get in that territory as well, both for the group, but also for individuals, as they're going through. So
we had a different approach to what you said, Tom, during COVID and in my role here. having come from a presidency and coming here. And my message to Dan and all our presidents was, you need a COVID team. You probably already have an emergency response team. You're not going to have people who are experts. I had some advantages. I'm a lawyer. I had worked in emergency response, both domestically, internationally, and that kind of thing.
Right.
But I said, you don't have people to fill all the knowledge gaps that we have on this. What you do have is a campus filled with people who have a lot of letters after their name. And the one thing we know that means is these people know how to think. So our job was, let's define the problem. I don't know if you remember this, Dan. One of our problems was ventilation. Well, who knows about ventilation? Well, you got engineering people out there. You got people with those kinds of at least some background. And our schools built those teams and challenged them. Go figure this out. You know how to think, do the research and figure it out. And I think, the proof was in the pudding, Dan. We had almost no outbreaks that were, if they ever happened, we would have heard about it from the government. But our people, all of these different people who made themselves parts of those teams, and it was kind of a hard water approach, Tom, to what you were saying, driven by absolute necessity and an unprecedented outbreak of disease. But it worked. We had people who realized, I know how to think. Let me just figure out what the dimensions of this are. But your approach, what you're saying, would have been even better if we were doing that from the beginning.
Well, you reminded me of something that I remember someone else saying this to me. I think the way in which our schools, and I'm talking here about the small to mid-size, the way that our schools responded to COVID is probably as good an example of team building as we could ever have. Because, I'll say there might have been 10 or 15 presidents that I was in contact with. None of them had outbreaks. None of them had big problems with PR or other things on campus. And so there's probably some things that got done in approaching the COVID situation that are transportable to ordinary times. One of the things I tell presidents that I work with now is that I get to give you all the fabulous advice that I didn't take myself. One of the things that I never got right was how to get two vice presidents to work better together when there was a problem. And the worst situation would be that both of them were competent in their portfolio and both of them had value. So you didn't want to get rid of either one of them, but you couldn't get the two to work together well. And as I've worked with presidents over the last couple of years, I've been much more intentional in helping them figure out how to get that working better. I wish that I had known more about how to approach those kinds of things. I have one pairing of vice presidents that I could never get to work together, and it was a real handicap on the campus. And I never figured out approaches that were really workable. Now, I'm not sure it would ever have worked really well given the personalities, but I've talked to some presidents who have done some very interesting experimental things, and in some cases it doesn't work, and one of them has to go, and in other cases it's worked pretty well. So I really think that that's a place, though, those of us who come out of the academic background, we've had a lot of experience working with faculty, but that's not the same as HR issues. And we don't have an orientation towards staff, and we haven't done a lot of supervision. Being a department chair is not the same thing as being a vice president or a president. So I think that's one of the weaknesses probably that's particularly the case for people like myself and Dan, for instance, who came up through the very, very traditional academic path. You had a lot of outside experience that was very different. So my contention would be you came into the presidency with some skills and experiences on personnel management that would have been far, far more translatable than, say, what I came in with.
And a lot of gaps in other areas that you helped me fill, Tom, that you helped me fill. Dan, maybe we move to our next segment.
Yeah.
What happened?
We just lost your video there.
Yeah,
There we go.
yeah.
You're back. I just paused for a second so they could clip that. Okay. Well, Tom, you've mentioned a lot of things that are challenges in university life, and your role now. You mentioned it. You're a presidential guru. I mean, you're running professional development for presidents for the Association of Catholic Colleges and Universities, and you do coaching. And I will say, you gave me a ton of great advice when I was starting out as a president It was so meaningful to me in my early days of doing this stuff. But there's just a whole myriad of challenges out there for presidents these days. And I wonder what you're sort of thinking as you encounter all this through other presidents about what's happening with the college presidency. What are the big things that are coming up that we need to worry about? Why is this role seeming to be so difficult for people? And there was an article, I think it was the Washington Post or somewhere, who wants to be a college president, you know? And so I wondered if you might reflect a little bit on what's going on out there and how it's impacting people like us who are in these roles.
Well, this last December was the 25th anniversary of when I first became a president. And so as I did board retreats for AGB and ACCU this fall, I was starting the retreat by talking about then and now, 25 years ago and now. And there are some things, I mean, it's easy to exaggerate differences. Art Levine used to do a great little shtick where he would read all of these press clippings about how faculty morale had never been lower and everything was terrible. They were from the 1830s. And there are some things that are universal. I mean, the kind of presidents that the three of us have been, you're always going to be the mayor of, it's either a large town or a small city, many constituencies. Board relations and the board president relationship is very important. You have to figure out ways to break through noise. It's lonely at the top, all that stuff. But I think there are some things that are just enormously different. You don't hear anyone anymore joke about the honeymoon period because there's no honeymoon period. And the honeymoon period wasn't so much that everyone thought you were wonderful. It was that everyone had a degree of patience. If you came in swinging an axe, even if you came in doing some wonderful, bold things, people sort of rolled their eyes and said, gee, you got to be here for a little bit first. Well, now presidents don't have the luxury of a long leisurely listening tour. Presidents have to do a listening tour. And what I say to presidents is the only thing that's changed is you have less time to do it. And you have to figure out efficient ways to do it. And you have to make sure that everyone knows they're going to be talked to, even if everyone doesn't get talked to in the same week. But presidents have to be able to move much more rapidly than ever before. And related to that is what I call the tyranny of the immediate. I remember when we had a homophobic incident on campus my second year, and we used it as an extraordinary teaching moment. It did an enormous amount for my credibility personally with students by the way I handled it. But we had a certain leisure. I mean, we dealt with it the same day, don't get me wrong, but we didn't have social media popping 5 minutes later. And I've talked to some presidents who have had incidents happen on their campus. And by the time they find out about the incident, all hell is broken loose. And so presidents today don't have the luxury of reflection. And many of us went into the academy in part because we value reflection. I learned my first semester in campus when we had a couple of incidents on campus that you don't get told lies when things happen, but you never know the whole truth. And so presidents today have to react as best they can with the information they have, and yet recognize that they can't paint themselves into a corner because something may come out later that is going to bite them in the you-know-where. So I think the no honeymoon concept, the tyranny of the immediate, the toxicity of public discourse. I mean, it was nothing like this 25 years ago. And I see people now comparing, it's interesting, we're all old enough to remember this, but I see people comparing it to the late 1960s. I think that's still I think that's a very specious kind of thing, because while there was certainly a lot of anger, and there was certainly a lot of vituperative disagreement there, but the state of public discourse in the Congress, to some extent in our churches, in our organizations, the suspicion about organizations, that is much more extreme than it was in the late 1960s. In the late 1960s, it was very much centered around the war for everybody, and to some extent around racial justice. Today, it's all sorts of things, and there's nothing that comes out where there's not immediately camps dug in on either side. I think that makes the role of the president in speaking publicly much more complicated. I don't have a lot of use for the presidents, and there are a couple of them who are always opining about how presidents today are too cowardly. I think they're missing. I think they're missing the point. On the other hand, I do think that presidents have a responsibility to speak the truth when it needs to be spoken. And so I think one of the things presidents have to today figure out is what are the kinds of situations in which they need to be out front on, and what are the kind of situations where, as we've all learned, silence is golden. So those are a couple of things culturally. I mean, the biggest change for the presidency is, and I tell this to discerning presidents, you can't come into office with the kind of financial and business acumen that I had 25 years ago. I mean, I developed a lot of financial and business acumen, but I learned it on the job. And today, most of our presidents, unfortunately, are coming into schools that need way more financial and business acumen than the market is going to produce for them. To take Pennsylvania, the Penns and the Villanovas don't necessarily need presidents with great, successful, sophisticated financial acumen, but most of our institutions do. And so I think that's the biggest thing that our presidents face that I didn't face 25 years ago is just the need for financial and business acumen. And I'm putting those as two very different things.
Yeah, well, I mean, if you don't get it together pretty quick, I mean, schools like ours, just because of the size,
Right.
you're in trouble. You're having an existential moment because it's just, a school with 1,000 students or something, you lose 50 in a class, and you're on the way out. I mean, it's really tough. And so, how to manage all that in a world where there's a smaller number of students who typically would be attracted to schools like ours. That's a real challenge, and it's something I think it takes some people a little bit too long to fully appreciate when they're coming in the door. That's a tough.
Tom, I'm so interested. You mentioned 6 or 7 different items that you've seen, and yet in some ways they're all connected.
Yes.
I began my presidency, this has gone back 15 years, Tom, with a panel discussion on the role of the university in civil discourse. And I remember sending it to you. We did a whole year presentation. Yeah. That's 15 years ago.
Yeah.
I just did a commencement address for an institution where my topic was protecting truth in a digital age. Now, let's bring that back down to the job of a president. All the things you mentioned, toxicity, social media, what Dan just said. We don't have lots of teams, to analyze all this. You're lucky if you have 2 or 3 people that can sit there with you. And no matter how good you are, in a small institution, we're not going to know all the things that are out there on social media on the issue of the day, on some crisis that just happened. So you're already behind the 8 ball. And I'll just finish and ask if you agree with this, Tom. And maybe you thought this even way back, but I learned this over time. My view is it is much harder to be the president at an institution like the 2 that you headed than it is to be the president of, say, Penn State. You don't have a whole level of middle managers. You do not have, who are going to decide how many bathrooms do you put in the new convocation center. You made that decision, but they have someone who makes those decisions. But they also have somebody in their communications department who's an expert in crisis communications. You don't have anybody like that. The president has to, divine all of this, and they're all interconnected. And if you don't have all of that information, what's being said on social media, we had a gun incident in our school. It's impossible to know all that at a small institution with 2 people in your communications office. How can you appropriately, properly, comprehensively, and timely respond? So I totally identify, but to me, they're all connected, and they're much harder. What do you guys think about that? I think it's much harder at a small institution to manage those kind of things than at a large one.
I think crisis is harder to manage. On the other hand, I think the struggle for our institutions, and something that continues to annoy me no end, is that even the higher ed press tends to define higher ed around the flagship publics and the nifty 50 and the Ivies. And so the thing I will say is, while the presidents of the prestige institutions have much, much larger benches, They also are more vulnerable because they have large benches, because they have to stand behind what happens. And our challenge is to get noticed. And I think that's one of the things that the two things that I think are so different, sort of intellectually, about the presidency is that we all wanted to stand out in some ways 25 years ago. Don't get me wrong, but we weren't preoccupied with what our brand was and how it was different from this place and that place. We looked for bragging points and things, but there were enough students around that you figured if you did your blocking and tackling well, and you had some good programs and things to sell, you were going to get your fair share. And now today, figuring out ways to have a distinct competitive advantage is a big challenge for our presidents. The other thing is, even the president is a relatively insular figure. I mean, our institutions, particularly the smaller ones, they're precious, and I use precious with both the derogatory as well as the sympathetic tone on that. But I don't remember in my first 10 or 15 years needing to be preoccupied with the external environment and external trends, and this kind of competitive situation. Today, the president has to be attuned externally, and that's not fundraising. That's just externally, all of the different things that have to be looked into. And all the centrifugal force at our colleges is towards internal issues. Think of all the strategic plans we've seen in which getting faculty and others to think about the external environment is pretty tough. Well, I think that's a big challenge for today's presidents, because it's a whole other part of their job that was not as pressing as it was for us who came into office 15, 20 years ago.
Maybe this transition us into the last topic, Tom, reactions on what's happening today. I just came from 3 meetings with high-level legislative folks where I'm talking about the impact of these institutions. And of course, I talk about the educational impact, world-class research institutions in our state, those sorts of things. But I also, as you know, I talk about the economic impact. $24 billion every year comes into this state. 1 in every 31 jobs, 1 in every $32 in the GNP. All of that. That is the language that is understood, and that is language that is transparent up there. And actually, these days, that's the credible language. That is what gets us heard. Not everybody talks that language, and maybe I'll start this part with the tough question. What would you have done differently, Tom, if you were in that Washington hearing as one of those 3 presidents?
Well, for one thing, I would have been. It's surprising to me because they were evidently prepped by lawyers, but I would have picked apart the question, because the questions were questions that were designed to be trap questions. And I think the mistake that those presidents made was that they performed as if they were well-trained, very credible academics and intellectuals. And this was about public imagery, and this was about symbolism and so forth and so on. I think though that we have, as a higher ed community, we lost the narrative of what was special about higher ed. And I'm not sure we're going to get it back. And I think we probably waited too long to talk about the practical benefits of higher ed. We always like to, we used to joke. I remember joking as faculty members that the real benefit of a liberal arts education you wouldn't recognize until you were in your 40s or 50s. That's fun. And it's actually true. But I think we needed to do a better job blending character development, the improvement of the life of the mind, and the practical kinds of benefits of the kinds of education we have that we provide. And so today, everything's about the practical and the pragmatic. And I think the other thing that we probably have done that hurt us was the arms race, because in fact, we have a lot of campuses. I don't have too many presidents that are in a bad situation here, but there are several presidents whose campuses have been overbuilt. And there were resources that they might have been able to spend better otherwise. I think that's one of the things that we probably haven't handled as well as we could have. But when I think back about my rhetoric, I think my rhetoric as a leader was much more effective in my second 10 years than my first 10 years, when I realized that you had to be a little bit more nuanced, and you have to sort of recognize that there were a couple of competing interests out there in the public that you had to be able to address.
You know, these days, Dan, I don't know what it's like up in northeastern Pennsylvania, but here, especially in Harrisburg, you cannot just talk about the educational benefits.
Right.
You have to talk about the community benefits. You have to talk about the workforce connections. You have to talk about economic development in your community. And that's, you know, one of those things that I think has probably changed dramatically, Tom, in the 25 years that you've been a president.
Yes.
But today, that's so much of the message. And your point, Tom, about the practical and the pragmatic, you know, and that's Washington, you know, in some ways that's Harrisburg, you know, that is going to be the focus. That is their job. The kind of things that we point out, as you said, Tom, character development, when we put out the data that says, you know, you're going to earn more money if you have a 4-year degree, you know, incontrovertible, Federal Reserve in New York documents that it's worth 14% a year, you know, in increased income over your lifetime. But I always put out the Pew study that measured 50 factors that have to do with life satisfaction and basic happiness. And in all but 2 of the factors, you know, having a college experience is part of leading a more fulfilled life. And as you exemplified at Alvernia, a much more community engaged life. And I think you're right that we're not doing as well at communicating both of those sides. We're doing the practical and pragmatic. It's how our schools stay open. They have to respond to community needs, but we're also doing those long-term things that we don't get to talk about as much anymore. But, you know, I think, you know, very well said. I agree with your description of the panel. I felt very bad for them. I think that's exactly what happened. I don't know if you know, one of my past lives, when I was in law school at Yale, part of my scholarship was coaching the undergraduate debate team. And I could have taken, you know, that hearing and used that as a teaching model for what to do and what not to do, you know. And that was an experience where, had those folks who were so brilliant on their own and all such accomplished people been allowed to just be themselves, instead of talking about context and legalisms and all this kind of stuff, they'd have probably been fine. You know, I'd have started a response to every question with, we have a Center for Jewish Life on our campus. We have a Center for Palestinian Studies. That's where it begins with us. Now, what was your question? You know, kind of, but tough times.
Well, one of the distinctions that I was wishing that they would have made is that part of the purpose of higher education is to make students uncomfortable. But making students uncomfortable intellectually is not the same things as making them feel threatened. And obviously, it's a very complex thing. Different people feel threatened in different ways, depending on who they are and where they sit. So I don't want to pretend as if this is a simple thing. But there is a difference between students feeling threatened and students feeling uncomfortable. That's a distinction that I always made in terms of the liberal arts. And I think that our best liberal arts professors recognize that. You know, the thing you just said, Tom, that I think rings true for me is we've also lost a communitarian narrative in this country. I was very influenced by Habits of the Heart and some of the books that were written around that time, and the de Tocqueville insight. You know, that we were overly individualistic. You know, we've boxed ourselves into a corner by making everything about individual acquisition of this and that. And we don't have a language to talk about community and the common good. I do think that a lot of our schools do that very well. Margaret Carney, who you know very well, was the one who said to me at the 1-month mark of COVID, she said, Tom, as you're talking to presidents, you ought to remind them that they ought to appeal to the mission and to the sense of campus community, because that will get people pulling together. But I don't think that I think we have lost the narrative about the importance of higher education being a public good and making the whole community better, not being just about the individual. One of the students last night talked about all of the things that the Reading Collegiate Scholars Program had done for her. And then she ended and said, and it has done an extraordinary amount for my mother and my family because of what the impact has been on all of us. And I thought, you know, it was a beautiful, beautiful way for her to end. It wasn't just about her.
Yeah. I mean, and the reality is that we really have good facts behind us about this kind of
We
stuff.
do. Yes.
We really need to figure out and learn how to and practice trumpeting it better in ways that people can understand and attach to. And that's, I think, where, we have fallen down in many ways. And the everything that's going on around us is contributing to it. I mean, it's hard to have a sense of community when the second you start talking about anything, everybody runs to their polar sides of the room.
Right.
But that makes it more challenging. But we are a place that has the ability to do this kind of stuff, and to trumpet our ability to do that, and to invite people into that space to do it at some risk, of course, when it happens. But we can't shy away from that opportunity, because it can make a difference in what's going on in the world, on our campuses, in our local communities, and in the bigger world. And we really need to have that at the center of part of the mission of what we're doing.
And the president can't be on one side or the other, but the president does have to speak to as much truth as they possibly can. I remember doing an op-ed. One of Dan's predecessors is the one who got me going writing op-eds, and I wrote a lot of op-eds my last 7 or 8 years. And I remember at the time of a certain political candidate, I did an op-ed in which I talked about words matter. And I went into a couple of ways in which words can be used very harmfully, and ways in which words can be used very inspirationally. So presidents have to be able to negotiate that without coming down clearly on a partisan side or on a side that is divisive. And that is a very, very delicate balance.
Mhm.
I mean, that's art, not science.
Yeah, yeah.
Tom,
Sure is.
two things that you said that I think are really striking. You mentioned that there's a difference between students feeling threatened versus students feeling uncomfortable. And that maybe part of our role is finding that balance, but making students, there's nothing wrong with being uncomfortable because you're hearing a new perspective or a new idea.
Right.
We are on Monday, Tom, at our annual meeting of our presidents. Our opening plenary is on the university's role in educating for democracy.
Oh,
And
wonderful.
of calls. We have a just retired chair of the Third Circuit who's written a lot on this and spoken on it. We have Lynn Pescarella, former Mount Holyoke and the National Liberal Arts entity. We have David Shribman, that you've met before, the double Pulitzer winner. And we have Bob Giuliano from Gettysburg, who's written on the topic. And we had a couple of calls sort of preparing for this, and Lynn made a very telling comment. She said, when she brings this topic up now, she actually has students who say to her, being forced to listen to a contrary point of view makes them feel re-victimized. And she said, how do we deal with that? Because that really should just be, you're in the uncomfortable, we need to hear that. Which then brings me to the second thing that you said, Tom, about the common good. Such an elusive topic. We had another whole year at Mount Aloysius where all we did was pursue what is the common good.
Right.
We started
I remember
off
that.
with, remember that, Tom? We started off with
do.
Father Myron, who went through the 7 Paulist virtues. It was fascinating, because of course there's no right answer, and there's a lot of good perspectives. But we finished with and at least I want to finish my comments, Dan, and then you can close us out. We finished with Guido Calabrese, famous lawyer, federal judge, dean of the Yale Law School, blah blah blah, just an immigrant story. And Guido was our commencement speaker, and he told this story of a Nazi-occupied home in Italy, and it was the home of his wife's family. They were Fitzy Continis, and they had taken over the home. They were hiding young Jewish boys, and they'd given them different names. And the difficult, angry, ugly commandant who was there was probably figuring out what was going on with these young boys. And one of them had his back turned to him, and he called him by the Italian name they had given him, and he did not turn around. He did not turn around. And Guido finished the story by saying the commandant didn't do anything about it. And his message was, it's never too late to do the right thing, to do a good thing. And that's part of our definition of the common good. And hopefully we're getting to that point with all of this, this disagreement, that we will find a way, to do that right thing, to find the common good in all this dialogue, because it's certainly a challenge for all of us. But Tom, thank you so much. So much insight there. And Dan, I'm sure would say the same thing. We could go for another hour, but I know Dan, if you want to close this out, we're there.
Thank you for joining us today. We've been speaking with Tom Flynn, President Emeritus of Alvernia University. We hope you enjoyed this installment of Higher Edification, brought to you by the Association of Independent Colleges and Universities of Pennsylvania and Misericordia University. See you next time.